The autumn breeze rustled through the trees as a bright young teen walked home from the local library, his backpack heavy with books about computer science and mathematics. His mother always said education was the key to success, and he took those words to heart. The boy had just finished his advanced placement homework and was looking forward to helping his little sister with her science project when he got home. As he turned onto Maple Street, he noticed a police cruiser slowing down beside him. At first, he didn't think much of it. His dad had taught him about law enforcement, and he always respected the badge. But something felt different this time. The police car's tires crunched on fallen leaves as it crept alongside him, matching his pace step by step. The boy's heart started beating faster when the cruiser's lights suddenly flashed. Officer Reynolds stepped out, his face stern and his hand resting on his belt. "Hey you, stop right there," he barked, his voice sharp enough to make nearby birds scatter from their perches. "Is something wrong, sir?" the boy asked politely, remembering everything his parents had taught him about staying calm and respectful. He could feel his phone in his pocket. Just one quick call to his dad would sort this all out. "You match the description of someone we're looking for," Reynolds said, his eyes narrowing. "Put your hands where I can see them." The officer's tone made it clear he wasn't interested in explanations. "Sir, I'm just walking home from the library," the boy said, his voice steady despite his racing heart. He slowly raised his hands, his school ID card clearly visible in his front pocket. "I can call my parents right now. My father works in law enforcement too." But Officer Reynolds wasn't listening. Instead, he grabbed the boy's wrist roughly, ignoring his winces of pain. The boy's library books scattered across the sidewalk as the officer yanked his backpack away. A passing car slowed down, but Reynolds waved them on with his other hand. "Please, sir, just let me call my father," the boy pleaded, watching his physics textbook lying open on the ground, its pages fluttering in the wind. "He can clear this up right away. He's actually an FBI agent." Reynolds laughed coldly. "Sure he is, kid. And I'm the President of the United States." He started pushing the boy toward his patrol car, leaving the books scattered on the sidewalk. The boy noticed the officer wasn't calling this in on his radio. Something his father had taught him was standard procedure for any stop. The cruiser's back door slammed shut, and the boy watched through the window as his neighborhood disappeared behind them. They weren't heading toward the police station downtown. Instead, Reynolds turned onto an old industrial road that led to the outskirts of town. As fear crept up his spine, the boy focused on memorizing every turn, every street sign, just like his father had taught him. He noticed Reynolds turning off his dashboard camera and radio. Another red flag. The boy's mind raced, thinking about his mom who would be waiting with afternoon snacks, his sister who needed help with her project, and his father who would soon realize something was terribly wrong. The old police substation loomed ahead, its windows boarded up and parking lot overgrown with weeds. The boy knew this wasn't right. This building had been abandoned years ago when the new station opened downtown. As Reynolds roughly pulled him from the car, the boy made sure to catch a glimpse of the cruiser's unit number, silently repeating it in his head like a mantra. Little did Officer Reynolds know, but every mistake he was making would soon come back to haunt him. The boy's father wasn't just any FBI agent. He specialized in cases exactly like this one. As Reynolds pushed him toward the building's dark basement entrance, the boy remained silent, gathering evidence in his mind, knowing that justice would eventually prevail. The musty air hit the boy's face as Officer Reynolds pushed him down the concrete stairs. The basement of the old police station felt like something from a forgotten time, with dust-covered desks and cobwebs stretching across broken windows. The only light came from Reynolds' flashlight, casting long shadows on the grimy walls. "In here," Reynolds growled, shoving the boy into a small holding cell. The metal door creaked loudly as it slammed shut, the sound echoing through the empty building. The boy's hands trembled, but his mind stayed sharp, just like his father had taught him. He watched as Reynolds pocketed the keys with a smirk. "Nobody's going to hear you down here," Reynolds taunted, his flashlight beam dancing across the cell bars. "Maybe this'll teach you to respect authority." The officer's footsteps faded as he climbed back upstairs, leaving the boy in near total darkness. Instead of panicking, the boy took deep breaths and remembered his father's words. "Knowledge is power, son. In any situation, observe everything." He felt along the walls of his cell, counting steps to know its size. His fingers found old etchings in the wall. Previous prisoners had scratched marks here. The boy's heart ached, wondering how many others had faced similar treatment. Time passed slowly in the darkness. The boy could hear water dripping somewhere distant and occasional creaks from the old building settling. He kept track of time by counting his breaths and listening to the faint sounds of traffic above. Every car that passed gave him hope that someone might discover him. Using his phone's location would be impossible. Reynolds had taken it along with his backpack. But the boy remembered something else his father had mentioned during their Sunday conversations about work. Old police stations always had emergency protocols. His hands carefully explored the cell's corners, searching for anything useful. Above ground, Reynolds sat in his patrol car, realizing his mistake was bigger than he'd imagined. Radio chatter mentioned an FBI agent making inquiries about his missing son. The officer's face grew pale as he remembered the boy's words about his father. He fumbled with his keys, wondering if he could fix this mess before it was too late. Back in the basement, the boy discovered something interesting. A loose brick near the floor, probably weakened by years of water damage. He worked it carefully, trying not to make noise. Behind it, he found an old ventilation shaft. It was too small to escape through, but maybe sound could travel up it. He heard Reynolds return, pacing nervously above. The officer's footsteps seemed more frantic now. Through the thin floor, the boy could hear snippets of radio conversations. Something about a search being organized. A smile crossed his face in the darkness. His father was already on the move. The boy remembered the backup phone his mother insisted he carry, a small flip phone tucked into his sock for emergencies. Reynolds hadn't thought to check there. With trembling fingers, he carefully pulled it out, shielding its dim light with his hand. The signal was weak, but it might be enough. Meanwhile, Reynolds was falling apart upstairs. He tried calling in a fake report about checking the old station earlier, but dispatch had no record of his patrol route changing. Now he could hear sirens in the distance, getting closer. His career flashed before his eyes as he realized the magnitude of his actions. The boy had managed to send a single text with his location before the phone died. Now all he had to do was wait. He could hear more vehicles arriving outside, their tires crunching on the gravel. Reynolds' panicked footsteps moved faster above, then suddenly stopped. A lot of new footsteps followed, accompanied by authoritative voices. Light suddenly flooded the basement as the door burst open. The boy squinted, seeing flashlight beams and uniformed figures descending the stairs. Among them was a familiar silhouette, his father, leading the team with a determined look that gave way to relief when their eyes met. The clock on the kitchen wall seemed to tick louder with each passing minute. The boy's father checked his watch again, his coffee growing cold on the counter. His son was never late. It was one of those unspoken rules in their household. A simple walk home from the library should have taken 20 minutes, tops. He tried his son's phone again, but it went straight to voicemail. His wife paced in the living room, already calling their neighbors to check if anyone had seen their boy. That's when his law enforcement instincts kicked in. Something wasn't right. "I'm going to make some calls," he told his wife, trying to keep his voice steady for her sake. In his 20 years with the FBI, he'd learned that the first few hours were crucial. He didn't want to imagine his son becoming another statistic, another case file on his desk. His first call was to the local police dispatch. "This is Special Agent Thompson with the FBI," he said, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "I need information about any juvenile stops or arrests in the past hour." The dispatcher's response made his stomach sink. No official stops had been logged. But then came a piece of information that made his blood run cold. One of his old academy buddies called back. "Hey, we've got reports of Officer Reynolds' cruiser going off its usual patrol route. He was last seen heading toward the industrial district. And get this, he hasn't called in his location for the past hour." The father knew Reynolds' reputation. There had been complaints before, but nothing that stuck. He'd seen the officer's personnel file, a pattern of aggressive behavior, especially toward minority youth, but always just below the threshold for serious action. Within minutes, he had assembled a joint task force. FBI agents and local police who trusted him formed a search grid. They worked quickly, quietly, knowing that making too much noise might spook Reynolds into doing something desperate. As they coordinated the search, a young patrol officer approached with crucial information. "Sir, we've got security footage from the library. Your son was walking home when Reynolds' cruiser started following him." The father watched the grainy video, his jaw tightening as he saw Reynolds force his son into the car. Then came the break they needed, a weak signal from a cell phone, pinging off a tower near the old police substation. The father remembered that building from his early days in law enforcement. It had been abandoned years ago, deemed too costly to renovate. The perfect place for someone who didn't want to be found. As they approached the old station, they cut their sirens. Through his earpiece, the father heard his team confirming positions around the building. They could see Reynolds' cruiser parked haphazardly out front, the officer himself pacing inside, visible through the dusty windows. The father adjusted his vest, checking his flashlight one last time. His team waited for his signal, but for a moment, he was frozen in place. Every case he'd worked, every criminal he'd caught, none of it had prepared him for this. Knowing his own son was trapped inside, probably scared, but trying to be brave. A voice crackled in his earpiece. They'd found a hidden entrance through the old parking garage. Another team reported movement in the basement. His heart pounded as they moved in, their footsteps silent on the crumbling concrete. Reynolds never saw them coming. When the father burst through the door with his team, the corrupt officer was already surrounded. The look on Reynolds' face shifted from shock to fear as he recognized the FBI raid jacket and the determined father leading the charge. But the father didn't even spare Reynolds a glance. His eyes were fixed on the basement door, knowing his son was down there. As they descended the stairs, flashlight beams cutting through the darkness, he silently prayed his boy was okay. When their eyes finally met through the cell bars, the relief on both their faces said more than words ever could. The basement air felt different now, filled with movement and purpose as FBI agents and police officers secured the scene. The father's hands were steady as he unlocked the cell door, but his heart was racing. His son stepped out, standing tall despite everything that had happened. They shared a quick, tight hug, both knowing there would be time for more later. Upstairs, Reynolds was being led out in handcuffs, his head down as officers rid him his rights. The corrupt officer's face had lost all its earlier arrogance, replaced by the pale realization of what he'd done. As they passed each other in the hallway, the father felt his son squeeze his hand. A silent reminder to stay professional, even now. Outside, the old police station was lit up by red and blue lights. News vans were already arriving, drawn by the unusual sight of FBI vehicles at an abandoned building. The father wrapped his jacket around his son's shoulders, shielding him from both the evening chill and the growing crowd of onlookers. "Someone should get his backpack and books," the boy said quietly, thinking about his scattered belongings on Maple Street. Even after everything, he was worried about his homework and library books. The father couldn't help but smile, his son's sense of responsibility shining through even in this moment. A young officer who'd helped coordinate the search stepped forward. "Already taken care of, sir," she said, holding up the boy's backpack. "We found it in Reynolds' cruiser. Everything's been documented as evidence, but you can have it back now." She smiled warmly at the boy, showing him that not all officers were like Reynolds. The father watched as his son carefully checked his books, making sure nothing was damaged. A group of agents nearby were already processing the scene, taking photos of the basement cell and collecting evidence. Their faces showed a mix of anger and determination. This case would be handled by the book, with no shortcuts. "Dad," the boy said suddenly, reaching into his sock. "I still have the emergency phone Mom gave me. That's how I sent the location." The father took the small flip phone, now evidence of both Reynolds' crime and his son's quick thinking. A senior detective nodded approvingly. This would help build their case. As they walked to their car, neighbors had gathered behind the police tape, whispering and pointing. Some held up their phones, recording everything. The father knew this story would spread fast, especially once people learned about Reynolds' history and his son's identity. In the car, away from the chaos, the boy finally let his guard down a little. "I remembered what you taught me, Dad," he said softly, "about staying calm and observing everything." The father felt a mix of pride and pain, proud of his son's strength, but hurting that he'd needed to use these lessons. They drove home in comfortable silence, both processing the day's events. Red and blue lights faded in the rearview mirror, but the father knew this was just the beginning. Tomorrow would bring questions, interviews, and official statements. But tonight was about family. The boy's mother was waiting at the door, tears streaming down her face as she hugged her son. His little sister ran down the stairs, jumping into the group hug. The father stepped back, watching his family hold each other, knowing how differently this day could have ended. Later that night, as things quieted down, the father found his son in the study, already working on his homework. "You know," he said, leaning against the doorframe, "that can wait until tomorrow." The boy looked up, a familiar determined look in his eyes. "I won't let him disrupt my life," the boy said firmly. "Besides, I promised to help with my sister's science project." The father nodded, understanding. His son wasn't just doing homework. He was taking back control, showing that Reynolds hadn't broken his spirit. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the windows of the FBI field office as the father reviewed the growing case file. His coffee sat untouched, his eyes fixed on the security footage playing on his computer screen. Each replay of Reynolds forcing his son into the police cruiser made his jaw clench tighter. But something unexpected was happening. As news of the incident spread, the father's phone wouldn't stop ringing. Other families were coming forward, sharing similar stories about Reynolds. A mother called about her son being harassed last month. A grandfather spoke about his grandson being wrongly detained. Each call added another piece to the puzzle. "Sir," a young agent knocked on his office door, holding a stack of papers. "You need to see this." She laid out dozens of civilian complaints filed against Reynolds over the past 3 years. Most had been quietly dismissed or buried in paperwork. The pattern was clear as day. Reynolds had been targeting young minority kids for years, but nobody had stopped him. The father's team worked tirelessly, piecing together evidence. Reynolds' dash cam had mysteriously malfunctioned multiple times during suspicious stops. His patrol routes often deviated from assigned areas, particularly near schools and libraries. Everything pointed to a systematic abuse of power. Down the hall, in a comfortable interview room, the boy sat with a child advocate and a specialized interviewer. His mother stayed close by as he calmly recounted every detail: the library books, the fake suspect description, the cold basement cell. His clear, precise testimony would become the cornerstone of the case. He wasn't just picking kids at random, the father explained to his supervisor later that day. Spread across his desk were photos of Reynolds' victims. All young, all minorities, all good kids with bright futures. He was specifically targeting children he thought wouldn't fight back or wouldn't be believed. The investigation revealed something else troubling. Reynolds had friends on the force who'd helped cover for him. Text messages recovered from his phone showed other officers warning him about internal affairs investigations, helping him avoid scrutiny. The father knew cleaning up this mess would mean taking on the entire system. By afternoon, Local news vans had parked outside the FBI office. The story had caught fire on social media. People were sharing their own encounters with Reynolds, and hashtags demanding justice were trending. The father watched from his window as protesters gathered, holding signs calling for police accountability. His son's story had become a catalyst for change. Other officers, good ones who'd stayed silent too long, began coming forward. They shared stories of trying to report Reynolds' behavior, only to be shut down by supervisors. The wall of silence was finally cracking. Back at home that evening, the father found his son helping neighborhood kids with their homework, the same ones who used to hurry inside when police cars drove by. They asked me if I was scared, the boy told his father. I told them I was, but being scared doesn't mean you can't be brave. The father's phone buzzed with a message. Reynolds had agreed to cooperate with the investigation, hoping for a lighter sentence. His confession would implicate others who'd helped hide his actions. The system that had protected him was about to face a reckoning. Later that night, as the father tucked away case files, he heard laughter from the living room. His son was teaching his sister self-defense moves he'd learned in his after-school program. Their mother watched proudly, recording the moment on her phone. Despite everything, their family had grown stronger. The investigation was far from over, but something had fundamentally changed. The boy's experience had shone a light on problems that could no longer be ignored. His courage had given others the strength to speak up, proving that one person standing up for what's right could inspire many others to do the same. 3 weeks into the investigation, the father sat in a packed community center, watching his son address a crowd of concerned citizens. The boy stood tall at the podium, his voice clear and steady as he shared his story. People listened intently, some wiping away tears, others nodding in understanding. What happened to me wasn't just about one bad officer, the boy explained, looking directly at the audience. It's about speaking up when we see something wrong. The father noticed several police officers in the back of the room, their faces showing shame and determination. Shame for what had happened, determination to do better. The investigation had uncovered more than anyone expected. Reynolds' phone contained years of text messages showing how he targeted kids in the community. He picked them up for minor things like walking suspiciously or matching a description, then tried to scare them into staying quiet. But now, those same kids were finding their voices. A teenage girl described how Reynolds had threatened to arrest her for reading in the park after school. A Boy Scout shared how the officer had accused him of stealing his own bicycle. Each story added another charge to Reynolds' growing list of crimes. The father's team discovered something else. A group chat where Reynolds and a few other officers shared racist jokes and planned their patrols to target specific neighborhoods. When this evidence came to light, the police chief had no choice but to launch a department-wide investigation. "Your son's case broke the dam," the district attorney told the father during a briefing. "We've got 15 other families coming forward, and more every day." The father watched through his office window as another group of protesters gathered outside, their signs now calling for systemic change rather than just justice for one incident. At the boys' school, things were changing too. Teachers started including discussions about civil rights and community policing in their lessons. The principal invited police officers who wanted to rebuild trust to have lunch with students. Slowly, fear was being replaced by understanding. One evening, as the father reviewed witness statements at home, his son called him to the living room. A news special was airing about police reform, and there on the screen was footage of Reynolds being led into court. The boy didn't smile or celebrate. He just watched quietly, understanding the seriousness of what was happening. "Dad," he said during a commercial break, "some kids at school want to start a youth advisory council for the police department. They asked me to help." The father set down his files, recognizing this moment for what it was. His son turning a traumatic experience into something positive for the whole community. The investigation was revealing deeper problems within the department's training and oversight. Old policies were being rewritten, Body camera rules strengthened, and complaint procedures simplified. Reynolds' case had become a wake-up call for the entire system. Local businesses started putting up signs welcoming all customers, regardless of race. The library, where everything started, organized weekly community meetings where residents could talk openly with police officers who wanted to be part of the solution. Trust was being rebuilt, one conversation at a time. That weekend, the father watched from his porch as neighborhood kids played basketball in the street. A patrol car drove by slowly, and instead of running away, the children waved. The new officer, fresh from revised training, waved back with a genuine smile. It was a small moment, but it meant everything. As evening fell, the boy joined his father on the porch. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sunset. "You know what, Dad?" the boy finally said. "I think something good is finally coming from something bad." The father put his arm around his son's shoulders, proud of how wisdom could come from such young hearts. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters and community members on the first day of Reynolds' trial. The boy walked beside his father, both wearing matching blue suits. People made way for them, some reaching out to pat the boy's shoulder in support. He'd become a symbol of hope for their community. Inside the courtroom, Reynolds looked smaller somehow in his orange jumpsuit, nothing like the intimidating officer who'd abused his power. When he glanced at the boy, he quickly looked away, unable to meet the steady gaze of the young man whose courage had brought him down. The prosecutor opened with a powerful statement. "This isn't just about one incident in a basement," she told the jury. "This is about years of systematic abuse targeting our children." Behind her, a screen showed photos of all the young people Reynolds had terrorized over the years. The boy's testimony came first. He spoke clearly, describing everything from the library books to the cold basement cell. The father watched proudly as his son answered questions without hesitation, his voice never wavering. Even the defense attorney's attempts to confuse him failed. The truth was too strong. During a break, other families waiting to testify gathered around the boy in the courthouse hallway. An elderly grandmother hugged him, whispering thank you through tears. Her grandson had been too scared to speak up before, but now he would tell his story too. Reynolds' former colleagues testified next. Some tried to defend him, but their excuses fell flat under cross-examination. Others, tired of carrying the weight of silence, admitted to knowing about his behavior and failing to stop it. Each confession added another brick to the wall of evidence. The most powerful moment came when the prosecution played the security footage. The whole courtroom watched as Reynolds forced the boy into his cruiser, leaving his books scattered on the sidewalk. The father felt his son's hand slip into his, not in fear, but in solidarity. They were in this together. At lunch break, the boy noticed a young officer crying in the hallway. She approached them, apologizing for not speaking up sooner about Reynolds. "I was new," she explained, "and scared to lose my job." The boy surprised everyone by offering her a kind smile. "It's never too late to do the right thing," he said. The defense tried to paint Reynolds as a dedicated officer who'd made one mistake. But the evidence told a different story. Text messages, patrol records, and witness after witness proved this had been a long pattern of abuse. The jury's faces showed they weren't buying the excuses. Outside the courthouse, community leaders organized peaceful rallies supporting police reform. The boy's story had sparked a movement bigger than himself. New policies were already being implemented in the department, and other cities were taking notice. During closing arguments, Reynolds finally broke down. He asked to address the court, admitting to everything. His confession was complete and devastating. He described how power had corrupted him, how he targeted kids he thought wouldn't fight back. The father watched his son's face remain composed. They'd already won, regardless of Reynolds' remorse. The jury took just 3 hours to reach a verdict. As the word guilty echoed through the courtroom, the boy didn't cheer or smile. He simply nodded, understanding the weight of the moment. This wasn't about revenge, it was about justice and change. Later that evening, The family gathered in their backyard for a quiet celebration. The boy's sister had made a cake, decorating it with the words, "My brother, my hero." As they sat together under the stars, the father noticed how his son had changed, not broken by his experience, but strengthened by it. 1 year later, the old police substation where everything started had been transformed. Fresh paint brightened its walls, and new signs welcomed visitors to the Community Youth Center. Inside, the basement that once held cells now housed a library and computer lab where kids could do homework after school. The boy, now a high school sophomore, spent his afternoons there helping younger students with their studies. His father watched from the doorway as his son guided a group of children through their math problems. The same determination that had helped him survive his ordeal now drove him to help others. "Your dad's the FBI agent, right?" a small girl asked, looking up from her notebook. The boy nodded, smiling. "And you're the one who helped catch the bad policeman." Another nod. The children knew his story. It had become part of their community's history, a lesson about standing up for what's right. The changes went far beyond the youth center. The police department had been completely reformed. New officers went through enhanced training that included sessions led by community members. Body cameras were now mandatory, and a civilian oversight board reviewed all complaints. The father served as an advisor, helping bridge the gap between law enforcement and the community. Reynolds' conviction had sparked changes across the country. Other cities sent representatives to learn about their new policies. The boy's case was now taught in police academies as an example of what happens when power is abused, and how a single voice speaking truth can create lasting change. At school, the boy had started a mentorship program connecting students with good police officers. Weekly meetings broke down barriers and built understanding. Young officers learned from teenagers about their fears and hopes, while students saw the human side of law enforcement. Trust grew slowly but steadily. The father's phone buzzed with a text. Another department wanted his son to speak at their training session. These requests came regularly now, but the boy only accepted a few, focusing instead on his studies and community work. He'd learned that sometimes the biggest changes happen in small, quiet moments. One evening, as fall leaves danced across the youth center's playground, a police car pulled up. The father recognized the officer. She was one of the new recruits who'd gone through their reform training program. She wasn't there to patrol, but to volunteer, helping kids with their science projects. Inside, the boy was showing younger children how to use the new computers, donated by local businesses inspired by his story. On the walls hung artwork created by students, expressing their dreams for the future. One drawing showed police officers and kids playing basketball together, a scene that now happened regularly at the center's court. The father joined a parent meeting in the main room, where community members and police representatives discussed upcoming programs. The atmosphere was different now, open, honest, collaborative. People felt heard, and officers felt connected to those they served. Later that night, driving home, they passed the spot where Reynolds had first stopped his son. The boy didn't look away anymore. "You know what's funny, Dad?" he said quietly. "That day felt like the worst thing that could happen. But look at all the good that came from it." At home, his sister was working on a school project about local heroes. She'd chosen her brother as her subject, not just for standing up to Reynolds, but for everything he'd done since. The father watched his children work together, seeing how adversity had strengthened not just their family, but their entire community. The story wasn't over. Real change takes time. But as the father looked at his son, now helping his sister with her project, he knew their community was on the right path. The darkness of that basement had led them toward a brighter future, one where justice and understanding replaced fear and mistrust.